So, hello everyone. My name is Nalini Saul. I'm the director of the Office of Career Professional Development, and today we are here to talk about one of the most popular topics in one-on-one counseling appointment, which is how to use the interview to tell if the opportunity is toxic or a bad fit. Let's get started. So, why does this session exist? One of the things that we were finding was happening to UCSF students and postdocs, no matter what opportunity they applied for, clinical positions, students applying to postdoc positions, postdocs applying to industry, postdocs applying to academe, whatever it was, some of the same sort of strategy or challenges were coming up. So I just want to kind of differentiate that this session is not so much about how to answer interview questions. This session is about how to assess whether or not a situation is not necessarily going to be a good fit for you or if it's toxic. And so at the end, we sort of realized that there were three things that were happening. There were some people who basically had a bad interview or sort of they were in a bad situation. And when we talked to them later, because one of the things you get access to is our office a year after you leave for free, if a person was in a bad fit, we were like, so what happened? And what we were finding was that even though we were saying things like, remember, they're interviewing you as much as you're interviewing them, there were sort of three main things that weren't happening. One is there was a group of candidates who basically were so sort of focused on really making a good impression that they weren't, that they sort of didn't even sort of realize that they should actually be looking for at an institution, seeing if it was a bad fit. Basically, I mean, it was sort of like a shorthand, like, hey, it's big name institution here. How could it possibly be bad? So there was a first group that didn't look for issues. There was a second group that looked for issues. And in fact, what was happening was during the interview, they were seeing red flags and they didn't recognize them as red flags. And so there's a second group, which is they didn't actually recognize what was going on was toxic, because there are some people who reasonably basically think you know what? I just wish someone would tell me. I wish you would just be like, no, this is a horrible place. You should run. Because that wasn't happening, they in retrospect could reflect on what was happening, but in the moment they didn't necessarily recognize it. And then there was a third group. Now they knew to look for that a good fit was important. They actually did recognize the red flags, but then when they got to the final moment when they were like, we'd love to offer you this opportunity, they were like, I mean, how bad could it be? I mean, it's really is any place good, right? And so what happened was people sort of talked themselves into it. And so what we realized was that there are kind of three things that we really kind of need you to be able to do, that we need you to be able to see. And so for that, I'm going to define particularly what a bad fit organization is. We needed people to be able to assess in the interview what it looks like when you're in a bad fit situation. And the third is that people need to be able to deal with the reality, because there's this quirky thing that happens when you interview that sort of sets you up to actually sort of shut down your critical thinking skills in that moment. So this idea, ironically, it's called SAD, but we need you to see, assess, and deal. So this is how we're going to do this. One of the things that is going to help is if you actually think of a previous interview. So the last thing or the most memorable thing that you ever interviewed for, and think about it as we're actually going through this. Okay, so let's talk about the seeing. So the first thing about seeing a bad fit is that we need to actually define what is the difference, what's a toxic work environment, what's a bad fit, and how is it different, and why do you care? The definition of a toxic environment is either the organizational culture, the organization, how they function. It could be the beliefs, it could be their values, it could be their policies, their processes. It's something about the people you're working with, and or something about the actual tasks that you do causes you such distress that it negatively impacts your morale, your productivity, and your well-being. So it either affects your performance or it affects sort of your well-being. And so but one of the kind of tricky things is that there's some environments that are absolutely toxic for everybody, right? It is not necessarily kind of people-centric. It's not necessarily a good fit for anybody. But the trick of it is that there are some organizations that aren't toxic for everybody. They're toxic for you. And so we just need to kind of really sort of explain how it's different and what it looks like when you're interviewing. When an organization is toxic for you, it means that certain things aren't in place. For example, your values aren't shared. So you might actually want to be in an environment, for those of you who are researchers, might have chosen a PhD or a postdoc where perhaps everyone in the lab is actually pursuing a particular career path that's not necessarily your career path. And so it's not necessary that your values might be because you might be pursuing a non-academic career path because you have a thought about, say, work-life integration. In that moment, one of the things that ends up happening is that the community around you doesn't necessarily kind of sort of tangibly support that choice. It's not necessarily that people sort of ding it. It's more that when there's kind of an opportunity or when people get invited or what conversations are happening, that they aren't happening around things that you care about. On the clinical side, this sort of looks like you might be really interested in a little bit more about say something like you want to practice evidence-based care and you're in a facility that doesn't necessarily value that, but your values aren't shared. The second is that your strengths aren't recognized. For example, you might be a person who at every organization, you really like mentor and you help other people, but people are like, oh, well, I mean, we're not recognizing that today. We're not promoting you. We're not actually acknowledging that that is something that's fantastic and that we think it's great. Your approach in terms of either particularly on the clinical side, your clinical approach to care isn't necessarily appreciated. So this would be, say, you might be a nurse practitioner who's like, I think that, epidural shouldn't be the first step. Or if you're a physician, it might be, I don't think that medication is the first step. But in this case, whatever your approach is, it isn't necessarily appreciated. The fourth is your work style, the way you communicate, the way you make decisions, the way you handle change, and the way you handle conflict isn't necessarily appreciated. What this might look like is that you might be a person who likes to think about what you say before you speak. But when you sit there silently in say, a meeting, people are like, well, how come you're not contributing? I wonder if you have any thoughts, as compared to actually being in an inclusive environment where they're like, hey, you haven't said anything. What's going on? What do you think? The final thing is that your goals aren't aligned. So I'm sure if this on the researcher side, if you haven't experienced this, you might have kind of seen maybe some of your fellow students or postdocs go through this, which is that you, for example, have decided you want to pursue a non-academic career path. And so it isn't necessarily important for you to publish, say, in like Cell, but the lab you're in basically values that. And so you're kind of struggling to sort of have a conversation. Or you basically work on the clinical side, you want to work in a clinic, everyone you interact with works in a hospital. And so your goals, people once again can't share information and support. In general, the reason why you care about this is the following, because in an interview, it looks different. In an interview where it's actually toxic for everybody's, and you ask people things like, so what do you like about working here? People are faking their answers. They're like, this is just a great place. It's a, world-class institute, like whatever. But the thing is that when you're actually in an environment that's a bad fit for you, people actually really possibly are happy there. So they're not faking it, which means that if you ask people things like, so what do you like about, do you like working here? They will say yes, and it'll actually be true. And so one of the first things that's important to do, and one of the first things we are going to do, is that you are going to take a couple of minutes to just really think through what your definition of a good fit is. Now, there's a way to shorthand this, and it kind of works like this. There's this concept called the sweet spot of work. And the way the sweet spot of work is the following. Oh, let's do this. The idea is that we all have certain interests, we all have certain skills, and we all have certain values. And the sweet spot of work is an opportunity that basically is like dead in the middle of that. So the right interest would be something like, this is my area of research. This is a clinical issue I care about. This is a population I care, or a policy issue I care about. So it's so I get to show up where I want to show up, and I get to kind of work with like the content that I care about. The second is it's the right skill set. And particularly for those of you going into faculty positions, when you're sort of thinking like, what's the distribution between how much research I get to do versus how much teaching versus how much time I'm spending on committee work, right? Like how much time do I get to kind of do those things that I like? So it's not just like what skills you do all day, but what's the percentages. On the clinical side, what that looks like is how much time might be, say, direct patient care versus, say, administration or other work. And then the third is values, right? And that's kind of everything that we were talking about before. And the basic concept is this, is that you are in a community where your specific values, your approach, your strengths, your work style are not just recognized, but they're rewarded. Like people are excited that you are bringing that to the table because it actually meets their cultural norms. And secondly, the idea is this, the right environment, if you understand and you respect the people with whom you work. So it's one that sort of like who you are bringing to the table is recognized and rewarded. And secondly, you basically respect and trust the people that you work with. And one of the interesting challenges, and this is important for all of you as you basically sort of transition, many of you are transitioning out of the educational sphere, out of the training sphere into jobs, is that there's sometimes a concern that says, well, don't I have to pay my dues in the first job, right? Like maybe it's not necessarily entirely the right content. Maybe it's not really entirely what I want to do with the population. Maybe, it's hard to be, there's diversity in community. So can I actually kind of ask for this? But the point is that people who are basically going into their first job are susceptible, if they're not thinking of it, to basically like making bargains and sort of bargaining themselves out of an environment that they need. And most of you, if you are moving from, say, a student to a postdoc position, a postdoc to your first industry position or your first academic position, and on the clinical side, if it's the same case, if you're moving into your clinical position, or if you are, say, a nurse practitioner moving into your first job in a clinic or a hospital or something like that, that one of the things you need is that you all need support, right? Like you are transitioning into a new field, into a new position. And so thinking about sort of what, even sort of honoring the fact that you are going to need support and want to be surrounded by people who are willing to answer questions, willing to kind of give professional development, willing to support you, so you can sort of establish yourself is something that's really key. So here's what we're going to do. There is, let's just pretend that this was Diana Prince. If Diana Prince was thinking, or I think to Kamala Khan, if Kamala Khan was thinking of like, okay, so when I'm thinking of my optimal job, or my optimal opportunity, I realize I may not be able to get it, but I have to at least have that as a benchmark before I walk into a job, or else I might be swayed by whatever is being offered to me. And so we're going to take a couple of minutes, and you should be doing this anytime you're about to go out and embark on a job search, which is just what is your ideal. You're going to say it, you're going to keep it to yourself, but the way that she might share it is, and so it would look like something like this. My career goal is to do X. And the right content is whatever. So on the clinical side, it might be something like, I really want to work with pediatric populations on, say, health disparities. On the researcher side, it might be something like, I really want to work sort of in this area of research. And I also want to expand my experience into these other areas. So it's this idea where you answer the question, I want to work with X or Y and Z. It's the right skill set, which is regardless of the organization. I would like the majority of my time to be spent doing A and B, with less time dedicated to B and C, or whatever, C and D. So you're just kind of thinking like, in your perfect dream job, like what is your percentage of time? And the third is the right environment, which is just beginning to articulate, like, what do you think you want to work in? Do you want to work in, say, a smaller, tighter knit environment? Do you want to work in a large, sort of like diverse, inclusive environment? Like, what do you want? What sort of seems to be important to you? I will note that one of the challenges for everybody coming through UCSF is that this is not usually a question asked of you, right? Like it's more sort of like, well, what have you done to be ready to work at UCSF or to come to UCSF? But I just need you to make a little bit of space to actually think through this question about if you're next in your next opportunity, even if you can't get it, right? Like in the same way that employers write like the perfect job description where you're like, nobody does all that, but you're like, yeah, but you need to put it out there that's at least what you're intentionally looking for. On the job seeker side, you do it as well. What is it that you're looking for? One of the things that you have to do is try to think about how can you use the interview to actually assess how much of this you are going to get. And sometimes it's not, particularly those of you who are able to kind of say things like, I'd like to spend like 35% of my time doing X or 65% of my time doing Y, right? Like this is important because it starts to give you a sense of even like how you need to ask questions, including things like, so, what are some of the main responsibilities that the person who you select will be working on? And what percentages do you think that each of those experiences would have, right? Like, and just even hearing, like, and so there was a person, for example, she interviewed at a job, and at the first one, they were like, okay, so basically you're going to be spending 65% of your time doing X, and like the other 25% of your time, and maybe the remaining remaining like whatever, 15% or whatever equals 100% of your time doing point B and point C. And then she talked to like the VP of the organization, and they were like, well, no, I mean, obviously all of your time is going to be spent like doing like B for like most of the first 6 months. And so when she walked out of that interview, she realized that part of the challenge was that the people on the team had not decided amongst themselves like what the metric of success was, which is a perfect way to get set up in this environment where suddenly you're trying to meet everybody's expectations. So it's both sort of not just kind of what your values are, but really thinking about how people are evaluating like what this person should be prioritizing that is beneficial when you're actually first doing this first step of thinking about like, what is it that you want? And so there's this first piece about realizing that when you're seeing it, you're seeing things that are out of your definition of preference. Now, the second, and this usually people are like, great, that's great. I had this moment to really like reflect on my values. That's actually, it feels good. But let's actually get to the interview. Like, how am I supposed to assess if this is a toxic work environment? And the thing about it is that usually when one of the big things that we always hear is people basically say, well, how come I just can't see? How come people just won't say, like, this is a bad place, you should run from here, you should leave? And the thing about it is that people are misunderstanding that, or not misunderstanding, but they're not fully appreciating how the individuals who are part of the organization have a vested interest, possibly just sort of keeping their job, to not actually be candid. It's interesting because actually, on both sides, people have an interest, right? Like you as a candidate are like, this is all about me and everything that's fantastic about me. And I'm here to minimize sort of whatever isn't skills I might not have. So on your side, you are presenting a face. And I just need you to know that on the employer side as well, they are also presenting a face. Partially, they're doing it because they want to hire, and partially they're doing it because one of the things about professional identity is that once you have bought into an environment, unless you really are like turned off by that environment, you have a vested interest in believing that you made a good decision. And so when people ask you, so what do you like about your job? You will find something that you like about your job, even if you're like, oh, this is a dumpster fire, but you know what? It's really great. You know, like the commute is really fantastic, right? Like you will say something. It's just a defense mechanism. And so you just need to understand that on both sides of the equation, both of you are engaging in a little bit of kabuki theater, and you just need to accept that. And then you need to basically account for it as you're asking questions and you're listening. But in general, the overall strategy is this. And for the clinicians on the team, this will work perfectly because you understand this intuitively, which is that you do not expect patients to be 100% accurate. If there are dentists on the group, I'm sure people are like lying to you every single day where they're like, yeah, I brush like twice a day. I do. And I also floss. I do that. Right. And you are like, yeah, that's good because that's important. But you are also paying attention to other cues and other data points to really sort of assess the situation. On the researcher side, you all are just naturally curious people. And so you are who are able to take in like data sets, right? And so you are just looking for data. And the main thing you need to understand is that you are not looking for candor. You are looking for consistency. And where for example, the researchers become fantastic at this is when they start to actually see the interview as particularly an interview day, and you think of it as a data set. And so let's talk a little bit about what the game plan is. And because there's some concepts that I just need to kind of frame for you that are really kind of systematic about interviewing. The first is that there are 3 archetypes of people that you're going to meet throughout the day. So when you get an interview, your first thing after saying, thank you, that is so exciting, I'm really looking forward to it. Your next question, if they don't send it, is, can you tell me a little bit about what my interview day will be like? Usually on the academic side, if you're applying for an academic position, they will send you something like, you'll be meeting with the department chair in the morning and blah, 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 blah. Same if you're applying on the industry side. On the industry side, on the clinical side, it's less likely. They'll just sort of be like, well, you'll be meeting with some people. So it's really great to connect with and appropriate for you to connect with whoever is coordinating it and say, thank you, I'm so excited. Could you just give me a sense of like who I would be meeting and what my schedule would be like for the day, just so I can prepare. But in the end, the thing that you're looking for is that there are 3 archetypes of people you meet. They are bosses. So your direct supervisor, whoever is directly supervising you, maybe it's the team lead on the industry side. It would be the department chair on the academic side. It might be the program. It might be whoever the head of the clinic is on the research on the clinical side. And so the idea is that you meet people who basically have evaluative authority over you. We're going to shorthand them as bosses. You meet people who are peers and colleagues. They have no direct power over you, but you need them to succeed. And in some cases, if you're moving into a position where you're supervising others, you meet people who you're going to define as subordinates. And one of the first things you need to do is understand that these are kind of three different data sets, and you're going to ask them slightly different variations of questions. So, that's odd. So for example, for Kamala, who might have said, I think I would thrive in a closer, smaller knit environment where people are social, communicate well, and support and help each other. No yelling, no microaggressions, no backstabbing. Like that's how she's describing it. What she would be doing is actually when she gets that job interview schedule, she is going to basically start to separate them out by archetypes. And so this is sort of like what a typical interview would be like. It might be usually you meet your direct supervisor. If you're going on if you're on the researcher side, your next piece is probably a job talk. And then after that, you meet with peers. You might have lunch with a colleague. You might, if you have subordinates, you might actually have special time with them. In the faculty side, it might be that you meet with students. You then might meet with sort of like whoever the head of the division is, or maybe you might meet with the vice president or the vice chancellor, or on the clinical side, it might be that you meet with the MDs if you're moving into a clinic, and then you probably end the day with your direct boss. So it's kind of like after you kind of recognize that there are archetypes and you ask for sort of the document, this is your data set. And the way that you start to think about it is the following. One of the things that happens in an interview is that there are kind of 2 or 3 archetypes of interview questions that are going to happen to you. Sometimes you're going to meet people who are like, I have 6 questions. I'm going to ask everybody these same 6 questions. And here is question 1. And there are other people who you meet, particularly if you're on the clinical side, maybe applying for like a residency interview, or sometimes when you're on the researcher side and you kind of go in and you talk to a PI because you're a postdoc, you're applying for a postdoc position. And they're just like, so tell me about yourself. Like it's super open-ended. They actually don't have specific questions. But whatever it is, your understanding is that usually you get between 1 and 3 questions at the end of an interview. And so if you imagine an interview is usually between 30 to 60 minutes, which is about, I'd say, that's enough for between 5 and 15 questions. What you're doing is realizing that they'll always kind of try to leave a little bit of space for you. And you're going to use those questions as the time that you're going to try to extract key data. So what it looks like is the following. What you do is that you kind of start to think about what is the question that you need to ask that would actually give you information that's going to be useful. So if Kamala was interested in like, is this an environment where people are social, where people communicate well and they ask for support and help? Her question is, how do I ask that? And one of the things that people think is, well, I need to really specifically ask it because maybe I just framed it wrong. But the thing you need to understand, particularly if you're talking about environment, is that you can basically ask the question much more generally. So think about, for those of you who are on the researcher side, think about your lab. For those of you who are on the clinical side, just think about whatever rotation you did. And one of the things that you might actually ask the person who would be directly evaluating you from preceptor to attending to PI is, what qualities and values do you look for those you invite to join your team or your lab or your clinic? It's a non-threatening question. It's very open-ended. And I will tell you this, that any environment that is basically functional and healthy, it is intentionally so, which means that the person who is hiring probably intentionally thinks about things like, we are looking for people who can collaborate. We are looking for people who really can work well on a team, right? And so the thing is that what you're looking for is the absence of that language. If they say things like, well, we're looking for go-getters, people who are really, who are independent, who have the ability to do X, Y, and Z, and nobody says anything about like being on an environment where team team-based activities, interpersonal and communication skills are important. It's not that you missed it, it's that it's not here. In the same way that if anybody was talking about all the fantastic things about being at UCSF, not a one of us would say something like, oh, and it's wonderful. There's just so much parking here. So you can just drive your car right up and just like park like anything. And the reason why it isn't said is because it isn't here, right? We will, of course, focus on those things that we think are positive. But the point is that that what you're looking for is not just what's said, but what's not said. And so it's this idea that says that if you are looking for a close-knit and for a functioning environment where teamwork is important and you recognize that's intentional, you start to think about the questions to ask the boss or something general. What qualities and values do you look for? And if nobody says anything about working on a team, then that means nobody is monitoring that. No one's rewarding that behavior. And that means that you probably won't get that. But that same question is asked as a variation of your other data points. For peers, you might ask not so much what qualities do you look for because they're not hiring, but how would you describe the values of this team or this department or this organization, right? And if you go to lunch, you might actually ask it differently. So what direction do you think this organization is going in, and what strategies do you think would be necessary to achieve those goals? And if none of them say things like, well, wherever we're going, it's going to be important for us to really work well together. And so it's really important for us to bring on somebody who can work well on a team. That's because it's not there, right? It's not part of the equation. You can ask subordinates things like, so what would you need from this person selected as your supervisor in the first 6 months, right? So for people who you're reporting to you, you're going to ask the question a little differently. And as you can see, at the end, you might go back to the boss's boss and say, what direction do you think this organization is going in? And what strategies do you think will be necessary to achieve these goals? Because if people at the top aren't really prioritizing people, it's not there. So if you are applying on the clinical side and you do meet with, I don't know, whoever, the nurse director or whatever, and they're not talking about like taking care of people, it's not there. But the idea is you can see that there are variations of questions, but the thing you're looking for is the following. When you look at the end of the day and you think back on the day, the question is, when people answer the question, did they give the right kind of answers? Things where you were like, oh, that's great. You know what? I hope for that. Did they give credible answers? As in, I believe what you're saying. Like, it seems like that you all work on a team. And actually, I saw multiple examples of you all being respectful of each other. No one talked over each other. Nobody made fun of each other. Like, I believe what you're saying. The third is, do people give a detailed answer? And the idea behind it is that usually when people are trying to be evasive, it's really hard to be detailed, right? Like, you can say things like, are you happy? And you're like, yeah, I'm happy. And then you can say things like, and what are you happy about? People who are not happy actually have to stop and think and really try to unpack what it is. People who are in functioning work environments, they say things like, you know what? One of the things that I really appreciate is that I'm on a team where my PI really supported me, right? Like, when I had an issue or I had a question, they made for me. I can give specific detailed examples. And I'm sure that for those of you who have been in healthy, sort of functioning work situations, perhaps you had a mentor who was great, or a supervisor or a teacher or an educator, whoever, you can think of a detail about what was great about them. It's hard to make that up on the fly. And we're going to do a little bit later, but if you think about somebody who actually isn't that great, it's hard to even come up with something if it's not really true. So you are looking for also the level of detail of the data. And the fourth is, does everybody give the same type of answer, right? If you've had a person who is a fantastic sort of mentor, you've been in a community where people are supportive, people basically kind of pick the same type of qualities. And so these 4 criteria are right type of answer, credible answer, thorough answer, same type of answer. This is what you're looking for. And if you get divergent answers, or you don't get answers at all, or you get sort of evasive answers, that is a flag, and that's probably your issue. So the weird thing about interviewing is that what you're looking for is that thing that is the absence of the data that you're looking for. But these 4 concepts of right, credible, thorough, detailed, and same type of answer across the data set, not an individual data point, is what you are paying attention to. Which means that one of the things that's really important is that you have to actually pick your most important criteria, and then you have to think about what question will get you to that answer. And so that is what we are about to do. What I've done is I've actually kind of explained, I've talked about a couple of different examples, and I've shown some sample questions, and you are going to use this to start to think about crafting what questions are going to help you extract information, and different ways that you can ask it. So you won't be thinking afterwards something like, well, I mean, maybe I phrased it poorly. No, there really is no parking at UCSF. There was no way to phrase it, right? Like it doesn't here. And so when you're talking about questions about productivity, and for all of you, particularly on the clinical side, or if you're moving into industry where you are new to the field, you need to have a strong sense of what is their data, what are you going to be evaluated on? So you might ask something like, what is your performance expectations? Or your benchmarks for success for the selected candidate in the first 6 months. The reason why you're using the words the selected candidate and not for me is because you are trying to depersonalize it. We're not talking about me right now. We're talking about you. I'm just a person who might be able to solve your problem, but I just want to know, like, what is your metric of success? So you might ask the boss, what your performance expectations? You might ask the peers, things like, what do you need to see in the first from the selected candidate within the first 6 months? You might ask a little bit more about, how does this position interact with yours? And how do you think this person should optimally interact with yours? With subordinates, it is, what type of support do you need to see from the candidate in the first 6 months? Because in the end, if you ask variations of this question, you will get enough of a picture of what the expectations are, including, are they the same things? Are they reasonable, right? Are you clear about why these are the metrics of success? Do you even want to do this? Right. And so you start to stop thinking of the interview as something that you are just kind of like vying for an opportunity. And you walk in like a consultant who's trying to assess what this person's problem is. And then when you go home, you think about whether or not, one, you can solve it, and two, whether or not you want to. It's a different way of kind of thinking about this interaction. But it really is true. All of you are walking out, even though you may not feel it, you are walking out with certain knowledge base and expertise. And this is expertise that you are now actually putting into the market, and you are asking, and you are assessing whether or not your expertise can help their problem. It might be able to, it might not be able to, but it's easier to think of yourself less as like a supplicant and more of a consultant. And so when you ask these questions, it's sort of the questions that a consultant would ask, right? What's the issue? What do you think you need this person to do? And then later on, you can then talk about whether or not it's you. For feedback, and all of you as people moving into a first new type of job, therefore you're going to need feedback to see whether or not you're meeting expectations. You might care about something like, how do I know if I'm meeting your expectations? How do you tell me? And so you might ask something like, if I'm the selected candidate and how I want to be sure I'm achieving your goals, how do you let people on the team know when they're not meeting your expectations? You can ask peers or colleagues something like, if I'm the selected candidate, I want to be sure I'm achieving your goals. How does boss X let the team know when you aren't meeting their expectations? With subordinates, it is, if I'm the selected candidate, I acknowledge I'm going to be responsible for celebrating your achievements and giving you corrective feedback to improve. What approach do you appreciate when someone is acknowledging your work? And what do you need to, and what about giving you corrective feedback? How do you like to hear it? And the point is that if these answers, particularly between the boss and the peers, is not the same, then one, believe the peers. It might be that the boss doesn't necessarily have an accurate assessment of their abilities. But as you can see, they're always an open-ended question, which allows a person to tell you anything they want. But you, once again, are organizing data sets, right? Is both the data between the boss and the peers, is it the same? And you can start to think about the environment that you're in now, and think about, if you were interviewing today, as with your familiarity with what your environment is like, how this might work or might not work, in terms of getting a better picture of what it is to work in your lab, or to basically, be part of your program, XYZ. You can see for training, which you also care about, is a question like, so how do you onboard and ramp up new staff? And the thing is that for those of you who are new, you might feel reluctant to actually specifically ask it. Like, well, I mean, I don't want to appear as if I don't know, because then they won't want to hire me. But in this case, you once again use third person. How do you onboard? What is your typical strategy to onboard and ramp up new staff? You ask peers and colleagues, what was your onboarding like? And you ask subordinates, what was your onboarding like? Is it the same? Does it make sense? You are looking for consistency. And the final one is just professional development. Just what types of professional developments do you encourage your staff to partake in? What have you appreciated most about the types and levels of support that you have received regarding your professional development is a question you can ask peers. And subordinates, it could be what types of professional development opportunities have you engaged in and what would you like to do next? But as you can start to see, you basically are asking sort of like you're taking the themes that are important to you and you're asking everyone the same question. And this is in direct context to what sometimes people suggest is something like, well, you don't have a lot of time. And if you've got 6 questions, shouldn't you split up different questions across your interview day? And the answer is no. If you actually have some deal breakers in terms of you will not feel comfortable taking this job unless you know this, then you are going to want to have multiple data points to increase your confidence that whatever X, Y, and Z is that's important to you, that it's there. You need to basically start your interview, your questions, by asking a baseline question. Like there are cultural differences about sort of how we communicate and how we communicate effectively. And you want to sort of account for those. But you basically start by asking something that a person might not expect that allows them to basically sort of exude their definition of joy, right? So it could be something like, I just want to learn about people on the team. What do you love most about being in science? Or what do you love most about being an MP? Just something where that person is going to do that equivalent of joy, which sometimes looks like rambling, like, and another thing. And then they're like the really specific details, right? And you're paying attention to that because then when you ask your other questions, you are actually gauging their affect against that first question. And the more, and usually sort of like what the gap is in terms of the disparate sort of answers is one way to actually sort of assess if this person is being candid, and if they are being candid, if the affect is the same, then you're listening to the words. You're like, what words are they using? Are they like, what's different about how they're actually engaging? But the point is that you do not, you're like every dentist in America, right? You don't necessarily expect candor, but you do expect that if you frame questions and you give people space, they will talk. And the idea behind it, there are 2 kind of main ideas behind this. The first one is that in the end, that's the next point. I'll say that in a second. In the end, once you kind of think about this idea that says, in this interview, I recognize that we both may have reasons why we don't necessarily feel that we can be candid or we might not want to share fully. And so I'm going to basically engage this where I'm going to allow this person to be as they're going to be. I'm going to use strategies to assess whether or not this place is, and use strategies such as asking questions, asking open-ended questions. I'm not going to necessarily require them to tell me everything. I'm going to allow them to tell me their piece. I'm going to look at the big picture later. And I'm also going to allow this person to assess sort of like what their baseline of happiness is, of joy is. And I'm going to use that to actually sort of assess if that affect is different when they're answering any question. And I'm going to try to figure out why, if it's different. Why is it different? Because in doing so, I will be able to get a more accurate picture with that particular data set about what I'm looking at. And you basically don't ask the first question, which is, would I be happy here? You ask the question which says, what type of person would thrive here? What it looks like often, just sort of from the clinical and researcher side, is this. On the clinical side, what that looks like is that when it's not a good fit, it might look like a place where it says, this is a great place for somebody who doesn't need training. Like if you're already experienced and you're already ramped up, like this is going to be a great place for you. If you already have expertise, this is going to be a great place. But as a new person who actually wants to be able to ask questions or ask for support, they sort of don't have the bandwidth for it. So a great person who would be here is a person who's already experienced, right? Like this is also sort of like on the researcher side, this is sort of going into a lab where the PI has no time for you. It's not that there's anything wrong with the PI, it's just that they don't have time for you and you don't have the time to get the information and the support and the training that you want or need. And they're not even assigning somebody else to teach it to you, right? And so there's this piece about sort of organizations is they usually comes down to, are they ready for you, however you are? That is what you're really focusing on, because this question about whether or not what type of person would thrive here, because the second question is that me? Because if the answer is no, then you need to think carefully about taking it. It doesn't mean you don't take it. It means you think more carefully about taking it, which brings us to the final piece, the deal with it. So basically, the deal with it is this. if I said this, I just did this for postdocs, for a postdoc, so I have the word lab, but in general, if the opportunity is toxic or a bad fit, it is going to be hard to accept what you see. It has a lot less to do with you and a little bit more to do with developmentally where you are. Depending on how much you wanted that opportunity, your brain is going to try to minimize the problems that you are seeing. And one of the reasons why it does this, I think this is my next, oh, no, I didn't. I'll just say it. One of the reasons why it does this is two things. One is because literally, usually when for all of you who have gone through a long training period and have invested a great deal to get to this point, where you were about to basically like fulfill whatever it was that you thought you wanted to do, or basically have decided intentionally to move towards. So this is what I sort of call like the Genentech issue on the researcher side, where it's like, it's Genentech. How could it not be great? But sometimes you might actually interview and be like, no, this is not great. What is this? Why is this happening? Right. And one of the things that's going to happen is that you are going to go through the 7 stages of grief. Like if you basically do the work and have already sort of prepped yourself to basically like say that you wanted it. You wrote a job description, you read a job description on it, you wrote application materials, you wrote a cover letter saying that it was your top choice, you interviewed for it, you told multiple people how much you wanted it, and then you're like, no, I don't, right? Like it's really hard for your brain to actually turn on a dime like that. And so you just need to know that technically you have already geared yourself up to like it, to want it. And so it's going to be a little bit harder for that competing data for you to sit with that and to actually sort of accept it. The other thing is that you are going through the 7 stages of grief. You will be disappointed in that organization. You will be in disbelief that this organization is whatever. It isn't a good fit for you, or it isn't great. You might feel, you might actually start bargaining like, well, I mean, maybe if I do that, I mean, but is any place happy? You might actually feel guilty. Like, I mean, how could I not take this? I mean, do I have another option? There are all of these external pressures that will actually talk you into a bad situation. It isn't that people are like, yep, that's a toxic dumpster fire. Let's go do it. It's more that historically, as a group in the biomedical sciences, the question about what do you like has been a lot less important as in terms than what do you need to do to basically move to advance. And you add that with the natural thing that happens in terms of finding a job, which is that you talk yourself into opportunities. And you could start to see how a large number of life scientists basically start telling them things like, maybe I didn't see that. Like there was once a person where literally like the person who was the boss was yelling at someone else during the interview. And the person was like, I mean, but maybe they were just having a bad day. I mean, maybe they were yelling. And I'm like, so how do you miss a, like, okay. Right. Or maybe whatever complicated, convoluted thing you saw where you were like, like you start to try to find a reason for it because you don't want the situation to be what it is. Sometimes you start to bargain. Maybe it's not so bad. Maybe they were having a bad day. Maybe they forgot to mention whatever it was that you thought was important. You start to talk yourself into it, but this is Dr. X's lab, or this is Genentech, or this is whatever. But as you all know, UCSF as an organization has sections and parts of it that are fantastic and others that have a growth curve. But we all get sort of caught up with this idea about what we think it should be because of pedigree. And the final kind of thing, particularly if you are like first gen, if you are a person who is basically sort of invested a great deal to kind of move to this part where you've overcome a great deal of challenge, is that you will tell yourself, but I'm sure I can handle it. I've done so much. And the way that organizations exploit this is that you'll say something like, well, is there support? And they'll say things like, no, we're really looking for a person who's like a self-starter and really, has the ability to go the extra mile. And I mean, you're from UCSF. I mean, you probably are, you're definitely a go-getter. And you're like, I am a go-getter. But the point is that like, and so for that reason, that's why you're not getting whatever software you needed to basically do your job, or whatever support you needed. So they basically kind of talk you out of what you basically should have the right to accept. And because all of you are go-getters, or else you wouldn't be here, it sometimes actually sort of helps flip you into a bad decision. In the end, and so you start to tell yourself things like, well, I mean, it's just sort of like a stepping stone. I could put up with anything for a few years. And the answer is you can. But the question is, should you? I mean, do you want to? And the answer might be yes, but there's just this piece about sort of intentionally making the choice. But in the end, to interview well, you will have already begun to identify yourself with the organization, the institution, the lab, the organization. Like, you will imagine yourself there. You'll imagine having lunch with people. You'll be like, oh, it would be great to work with X, and ooh, to work with these and Y. You do this. And so the final thing that's a little bit challenging as we end is this, is that if it is a bad fit, the maddening thing is that you will never know. You will never know, right? Like, you will walk away from it, and you will be like, oh, but I mean, maybe they were just having a bad day. I will sort of say the following, though. I did once actually interview at a job, and I didn't take it. And a colleague of mine actually interviewed there and took the job and left under a year. And then we had lunch. And I've got to admit, even though I know all of this, it was incredibly satisfying to have her say things like, oh, no, that was a dumpster fire. And I'm like, go on. Right. And so I recognize that there's just this sense that, that sometimes people feel they're walking away from something without kind of knowing what they're walking towards. And so I end with this, which is the final thing that you need to know, is that it's that even though you see it, it might also still make sense for you to choose this experience, which might be toxic or a bad fit for you. There might be a learning opportunity. You might have a visa issue. You might want to be close to family. So they're personal goals. The idea that it's toxic or a bad fit doesn't mean you don't take it. It means you take it with intention. You take it with intentionality, right? Which is that you show up every single day and you acknowledge, I am not in the best work environment, and you take breaks and you take care. You don't pretend it's not happening. You find internal and external allies quickly. So as soon as there's one little blip, you are like, I need to basically reach out for support, because you acknowledge I'm not in a healthy environment. You clearly define your goals when you're there. For example, there was a nurse midwife who worked in a hospital and she didn't like it, but she wanted to go back to Wisconsin and open her own NP practice. So she was like, I am very clear about why I'm working in a hospital, because I can see the largest set of births in the shortest period of time. So she had a list. She was like, breech births, twins, triplets, maternal age, like advanced maternal age. And she was like, as soon as I got that, I was out of there. So you basically are clear about what you get out of the experience and you keep going. And the final thing is that for some people, you take the job and you keep searching. Because in the end, the thing that you remember is your agency, that if you move into a position that's a bad fit, you chose it. And it doesn't mean that you deserve bad things to happen to you. But you do have agency in thinking about a couple of things, which is how quickly can you move out of that experience? How can you still maintain your integrity when you're in it? And how can you basically learn from this and not perpetuate the situation when you are the one in power? And so with that, that is how some general strategies about how you basically sort of engage or sort of think strategically about using the interview to tell if it's toxic or a bad fit. The thing that I did not include, but we will send the email for, is that if you want to talk about this more or want to get some help or want to actually talk with someone, of course, the slides we'll be sending it out by the end of the day, but all of you have access to career counseling with me or some of my colleagues, including Dr. Rachel Kerr, who is on the line and who's on the video. And so if you want to talk more about this or talk about anything about your career and professional development, you have access to our office up in between the time you graduate until 1 year after you graduate. Just say that you were previously at the institution and we see you and we have a confidential conversation. But this is an important decision, and I really commend all of you for taking the time out of your crazy lives to really think about how to engage in this skillfully. And if you need more support, we are here in the Office of Career and Professional Development.